Hi everyone. Heart is a muscular organ just slightly bigger than a person's loosely clenched fist. It is located in the thorax, more specifically between two lungs in a space called mediastinum. The heart is covered by a tough membrane called pericardium that separates the heart from the other structures in the mediastinum. This position allows the heart to do this job, which is to pump oxygen-rich blood to the entire body and to send poorly oxygenated blood to the lungs, where gaseous exchange takes place. The heart is made up of four chambers. As a whole can be functionally divided into right heart made up of right atrium and right ventricle, and a left heart made up of left atrium and left ventricle. And both atria have pouch-like protrusions called auricles which can increase their capacity when needed. Now, poorly oxygenated blood from our bodies and tissues enters the right atrium through the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. From there, blood passes into the right ventricle, which pumps into the pulmonary trunk on a voyage towards the lung and is considered part of pulmonary circulation. On the other hand, after gas exchange takes place in the lungs, oxygenated blood returns from the lungs through the four pulmonary veins which drain into the left atrium. Then oxygenated blood goes in the left ventricle and from there it's pumped into the aorta so that it reaches the whole body and is considered part of the systemic circulation. So looking at it in three dimensions, the heart looks like a upside down tipped over pyramid with four sides, a base that mostly posterior and an apex or tip that points anteriorly and slightly to the left. On an interior or posterior view in two dimensions, the heart is shaped like a trapezoid, so it has a superior and inferior as well as a right and left border. It is important to understand what comprises the border of heart because the heart is rotated to the left on its longitudinal axis within the mediastinum, so the apex is directed more posterior laterally. The superior border is formed by the left and right atria. Along the superior border from right to left, there the superior vena cava which enters the right atrium. Then there is the ascending aorta which emerges from the left ventricle and then curves posteriorly to form an arch called aortic arch. Finally, there is the pulmonary trunk and its two branches, the right and left pulmonary arteries, which the right pulmonary artery going under the aortic arch. The inferior border is almost horizontal and is made up of mainly by right ventricle and a part of left ventricle. The right border is made up by right atrium and it's between the superior and inferior vena cava, and finally the left border is mainly made up by the left ventricle and a part of the left auricle. Now pay here attention because the end of the inferior border along with the lower part of the left border make up by the apex of the heart which represent the tip of the left ventricle. Some of these features can also be identified on a posterior anterior chest X-ray. The heart is between the lungs and right border made up by right atrium as well as the left border made up by the left ventricle and part of the left auricle can be seen clearly. Above the left auricle we can identify the pulmonary artery and the aortic arch. The superior and inferior border of the heart are not as easy to see as the right and left borders. Now let's identify the structures in the interior and posterior view. On an interior view, we can identify several structures starting with the four chambers and ending with the great vessels. From right to left, there is the most of the right atrium located superiorly and inferior to it, the right ventricle. They are separated by coronary sulcus, also called arterioventricular groove or AV groove for short. Then there's the auricle of the left atrium and the left ventricle, which are also separated by the coronary sulcus. The right ventricle and the left ventricle are separated by anterior intraventricular sulcus. Now moving on, you can actually see parts of the great vessels on an anterior view. So from right to left, there is the part of superior vena cava which opens in the superior part of the right atrium. Then there is the part of inferior vena cava which also opens in the right atrium, but the opening can only seen on posterior view. Then there is the ascending aorta which emerges from the left ventricle and then arches toward the back to form aortic arch. The branches of the aortic arch can be seen well, and from right to left they are the right brachiocephalic trunk which branches into the right subclavian artery and right common carotid artery, the left common carotid and the left subclavian. Finally, medial to the left auricle, there is the pulmonary trunk which emerges from the right ventricle and branches into the left and right pulmonary arteries, with the right pulmonary artery going under the aortic arch. Interestingly enough, the superior portion of the proximal left pulmonary artery is connected to inferior surface of the aortic arch by ligamentum arteriosum. Even though this fancy term element is just a fibrous band, now back during embryological development, it is used to connect the aortic arch and pulmonary trunk as an adaptation of the fetal circulation in the intrauterine life. Now on posterior view, we can see the left atrium and the left auricle, most of left ventricle as well as the right atrium and the right ventricle. As before, the atria and ventricle are separated by coronary sulcus, but now the right and the left ventricles are separated by posterior intraventricular sulcus. In upper portion above coronary sulcus, there are great vessels, the left and right pulmonary veins, which brings oxygenated blood. In the left atrium, the left and right pulmonary arteries which emerge from pulmonary trunk and bring deoxygenated blood to the lungs above them, the aortic arch and superior and inferior vena cava. So it is also important to visualize that the most anterior portion of the heart is the right ventricle and the posterior portion of the heart is the left atrium, which lies directly anterior to the esophagus. Have a look at each chambers of the heart, starting with the right atrium. This is a right atriolateral view of the heart where we dissected the right atrium in order to see its content. The right atrium has smooth thin-walled posterior part called sinus venerum, where both superior and inferior vena cava as well as the coronary sinus open. Then there is the rough muscular anterior part formed by the pectine muscle. Externally, the smooth and the rough part of the atrium are separated by vertical shallow groove called sulcus terminalis. Internally, the structures are separated by vertical ridge called crista terminalis. Inferiorly, you can also see right atrioventricular orifice, also known as a tricuspid orifice, which is where the blood from atrium goes into the ventricle. Now the superior vena cava enters through the superior part of the right atrium which is roughly at the level of third intercostal cartilage. The inferior vena cava opens inferiorly almost parallel to the superior vena cava, roughly at the level of fifth costal cartilage. Finally, coronary sinus opens between the tricuspid orifice and the inferior vena cava orifice. Now the right and left atrium are separated by the intra-atrial septum, which has depressions called oval fossa or fossa ovalis, which is the remnant of oval foramen or foramen ovale that connects the atria during embryological development. In fetal life, oxygen-rich and nutrient-rich blood travels directly into the left atrium from the right atrium via foramen ovale to bypass the pulmonary circulation. Move on to the right ventricle. Just like before, we are going to look at the anterior view of the heart, where we dissected the right ventricle. The right ventricle has an inflow part where blood gets inside the ventricular and outflow part through which blood leaves the right ventricle. The inflow part has muscular elevations called the tuberculi corni, and the outflow part is formed by an infundibulum called the conus arteriosus, located superiorly and lead to the pulmonary trunk. Now the right ventricle receives blood from the right atrium through the tricuspid orifice, which is posterior to the body of the sternum at the level of fourth and fifth intercostal space. The tricuspid orifice is surrounded by a fibrous ring that's a part of the fibrous skeleton of the heart, keeping its shape constant. And in order for blood to flow from the right atrium to the right ventricle at exactly the right time during each heartbeat, there is the tricuspid valve attached to the tricuspid orifice, and it's called the tricuspid valve because it has three cusps or leaflets that opens and close during systole and diastole, an anterior one, a posterior one, and a septal one. The base of each cusp is attached to the fibrous ring, while free edges of the cusps are attached to cordoni tendi. These cordoni tendi anchor the leaflet to papillary muscles, which are projections of the right ventricle. The anterior papillary muscle is the largest one and arises from the anterior wall of the right ventricle. Its chordae tendineae attach to the anterior and posterior cusps of the wall. Then there's the posterior papillary muscles that arises from the inferior wall of the right ventricle. Its chordae tendineae attach to the posterior and septal cusps. Finally, there's the septal papillary muscles which arises from the intraventricular septum and its chordae tendineae attached to anterior and septal cusps. This smart and complicated mechanism is mainly meant to block the backflow of blood from the right ventricle to the right atrium during the systole, which is when the heart contracts to pump blood out of the ventricles. Now done with right ventricle, the intraventricular septum or IVS separates the two ventricles and form a part of the wall of each ventricle. It's made up of muscular and membranous parts. Now muscular part of IVS is mostly part of left ventricle, so it's 2 to 3 times thicker than the rest of the right ventricle. The membranous part is a thin membrane that's part of fibrous skeleton of heart, and it's located superiorly and posteriorly. On the right side of IVS, the septal cusps of the tricuspid valve attaches to the middle of the membranous part. Finally, in the right ventricle, there is also muscular bundles that crosses from inferior part of IVS to the base of anterior papillary muscle. This is called the moderator band, and it helps the right ventricle contract properly by making the anterior papillary muscle contract at the same time as the other two papillary muscles. Briefly talk about blood flow. The right atrium contracts when the right ventricle is empty and relaxed. So blood from the right atrium passes through the tricuspid valve and enters into the right ventricle. Finally, blood then leaves the right ventricle through the pulmonary valve, which is located at the level of left third costal cartilage, and enters the pulmonary trunk, where blood is sent to the lungs for oxygenation. The left atrium is slightly thicker than the right atrium, and along with the left auricle and the pectine muscles within it form a large part of the base of the heart. The rest of the left atrium is smooth. The four pulmonary veins, namely the left superior, left inferior, right superior, and right inferior pulmonary veins, enters the smooth part of the left atrium posteriorly. Unlike other structures of the heart, the pulmonary veins don't have any valve, and blood flows through them and into the right atrium freely. Now on the interatrial septum, there is a semilunar depression indicating the floor of oval fossa, with the surrounding ridge being the valve of oval fossa, which, as mentioned before, used to represent a communication between the atria during embryonic development. Finally, inferiorly, there is the left AV orifice or material orifice, through which blood flows from the left atrium into the left ventricle. Finally, let's look at the left ventricle, which form apex of the heart. Since pressure inside the left ventricle is higher, its valves are 2 to 3 times as thick as those of the right ventricle. The left ventricle valves have more but finer tuberculi corni than the right ventricle. It also has smooth valves, non-muscular part, which is called aortic vestibule, which leads to aortic orifice and aortic valve. The aortic valve is located posterior to left of the sternum at the level of third intercostal space. The mitral orifice is surrounded by mitral valve, which is located posterior to the sternum at the level of fourth costal cartilage. The mitral valve is also referred to as a bicuspid valve as it only has two cusps, anterior and posterior, compared to three cusps of the tricuspid valve. Each of cusps are attached to the papillary muscle through chordae tendineae, which allows the cusps to resist the high blood pressure during a heart contraction. Now that we are done with heart chambers, we will now look at the pulmonary trunk and aorta. Blood flows from right ventricle to pulmonary trunk via pulmonary semilunar valve, while blood flow from the left ventricle, the ascending aorta via aortic semilunar valve. These valves have three cusps, each called semilunar cusp. The pulmonary valve has anterior right left cusp, while aortic valve has posterior right and left cusp. Unlike tricuspid and mitral valve, the semilunar valve are smaller and don't have chordae tendineae to support them. Instead, during ventricular relaxation, blood is forced backward into the heart, where the cusps catch this reversed blood flow and snap closed like an umbrella caught in the wind. The cusp edges comes together to close the semilunar valves and support each other as their edges meet to prevent backflow. The edge of each cusp is thickened where they meet, forming the lonule, and at apex of the angulated free edge they form the nodule. During ventricular contraction, the semilunar valve open as they are pressed toward the walls of the pulmonary trunk and aorta. Superior to each semilunar cusp, the wall of the origin of pulmonary trunk and the aorta are bit dilated, forming a sinus where blood gets in to prevent the cusps from sticking to the wall of the vessels when they open, and also helps them close back up. The sinus formed above the right aortic cusp is the origin of the right coronary artery, and the sinus from above the left aortic cusp is the origin of left coronary artery, both of which nourish the heart muscles. During ventricular relaxation, when the semilunar valves are closing, the backflow of the blood towards the heart fills these sinuses, and force of this backflow is what allows the left and right coronary arteries to fill. In next lecture, we will talk about the conducting system of heart. So thanks for supporting and watching this lecture.